The Subcommittee on Space will come to order. Good morning. Welcome to today's hearing entitled the NASA Authorization Act of 2013. In front of you are packets containing the written testimony, biographies, and required truth and testimony disclosures for today's witnesses. I recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. The discussion draft of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration Act of 2013 before us today is the result of input from a wide variety of interests throughout the science and space communities. The outreach efforts of this committee have been unprecedented, and I'm proud of the draft we have put together. My goal for this hearing is to ensure that all of our members have an opportunity to ask questions, raise concerns, and debate important topics. I expect the tenor of today's hearing to be respectful. We're all here because we care about NASA and want it to succeed. The draft bill includes a top-line budget of over $16.8 billion and authorizes the agency for 2 years. This budget is consistent with the requirements of the Budget Control Act. In regards to sequestration, I want to take a moment to point out that I and several of my colleagues sitting here in this room worked extremely hard to avoid getting to this point. We've offered solid solutions and replacements for these damaging cuts, and we stand ready to work with the Senate and the administration to replace the sequester with responsible strategic cuts. This authorization bill reflects a sincere effort to maximize return to the taxpayer while working to protect America's role as the world leader in space exploration. It is realistic and reflective of the hard choices we must make as a nation and provide support for agreed-upon priorities. The stark reality is that if we fail to reform mandatory spending, discretionary funding for space, science, and research will continue to shrink. The administration must focus on core programs such as the Space Launch System and Orion Crew Capsule, the International Space Station, the James Webb Space Telescope, and the Commercial Crew Program. The Space Launch System is authorized at over $1.7 billion and the Orion Crew Capsule at $1.2 billion. The SLS and Orion will take our astronauts deeper into space than ever before. I am committed to the success of these assets and ensuring their continued on-time development and appropriate prioritization moving forward. The Commercial Crew Program is authorized at $700 million, but let me be clear. This is not a blank check for the administration. The bill includes several accountability measures and a flight readiness deadline of December 31st, 2017. This deadline is not negotiable. NASA must do whatever is necessary in its acquisition model to meet this deadline, even if that means radically altering their current plans. The International Space Station is authorized at over $2.9 billion, and the bill includes a framework for NASA to use for determining the future life of the station. This committee intends to ensure that ISS is utilized to the greatest extent possible and that every dollar is efficiently located with a priority placed on microgravity research. The $4.62 billion authorized for the Science Mission Directorate ensures critical programs will continue on schedule, including the James Webb Space Telescope and planetary science missions. Over the last 5 years, the Earth Science Program has grown by more than 40% at the expense of other critical missions within the Science Mission Directorate and elsewhere in NASA. There are 13 agencies throughout the federal government that currently fund over $2.5 billion in climate science research, but only one agency does space exploration and space science. This bill ensures a balanced portfolio of science mission programs by simply moderating the increases that Earth Science has received over the last 5 years. The Aeronautics Mission Directorate promotes technology sharing among government agencies and infuses critical research and data into the commercial market. It is authorized at $565 million with requirements for interagency roadmaps for various technology areas. This bill authorizes $500 million for the Space Technology Program. This investment in game-changing technology development is crucial for future exploration missions, both robotic and human. We also recognize the role this program can play in finding innovative solutions to tough problems. The President's budget request this year included a major structural change to STEM programs at NASA. The full Science Committee held a hearing that revealed significant bipartisan concerns about this plan. While the committee generally supports consolidation of government programs to ensure efficiencies, this change was poorly conceived and is not ready for implementation. For this reason, the bill prohibits NASA from implementing those changes. Another request in the President's budget was an asteroid retrieval mission, or ARM. While the committee supports the administration's efforts to study near-Earth objects, this proposal lacks in details, a justification, or support from NASA's own advisory bodies. Because the mission appears to be a costly and complex distraction, this bill prohibits NASA from doing any work on the project, and we will work with appropriators to ensure the agency complies with this directive. In addition to authorizing funding and giving direction to the agency for critical missions, the committee has included several measures to ensure good government practices and transparency within NASA, including reform for the use of Space Act agreements, changes to termination liability requirements, and stricter cost growth controls. As people in our districts and across the nation continue to struggle to find jobs and put food on the table, we must ensure that every single dollar appropriated to NASA is spent effectively and efficiently. This bill provides common sense guidance and prioritizes those most critical NASA missions. I now recognize the ranking member, the gentlelady from Maryland, Ms. Edwards, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for calling this hearing to discuss a draft of the proposed NASA authorization bill. NASA has been and should continue to be the nation's crown jewel for spurring innovation, highly skilled and good-paying jobs, and inspiring the next generation of scientists. It is vital that any new NASA authorization match that same standard. I think we both agree that a strong NASA is critical to the nation and that this authorization is vitally important, and it's an important opportunity to set the policy, direction, and authorize funding needed to ensure America's global leadership in space. It is my hope that we can work together to ensure that NASA's mission is clear, establish expectations that will inspire the public and the workforce, and then provide the level of resources needed to enable the agency to be successful. Doing otherwise would not only be a disservice to the men and women at NASA, its contractor workforce, and the American people, but would effectively set the agency on a path to failure. I know that members of this committee want to see NASA thrive, and we must have an authorization bill that ensures that. Mr. Chairman, we are not, nor should we be, the scientists and engineers who devise the programs and projects to meet the high-level goals set for the agency. That should be left to the capable experts at NASA. I was pleased to see that the draft bill contains a number of reporting requirements and other provisions taken from the 2010 House version of the NASA Authorization Act of 2010, since those were not included in the enacted law because members only voted on the Senate bill in 2010. Developing a plan or a roadmap for human exploration to Mars and seeking criteria for evaluating the potential extension of ISS operations beyond 2020 are just a few of the key areas where I see the potential to build consensus. I'm concerned, however, with several aspects of this draft bill, and I question whether in the end this draft will serve to ensure our nation's hard-earned leadership in space and all the inspiration, discovery, international standing, and economic benefits that such leadership brings. First, the draft bill would appear to shift the emphasis of NASA's core mission to human exploration. This is counter to the policy of NASA's Organic Act, the National Aeronautics and Space Act of 1958, as well as to the policy statements of multiple NASA authorizations that have seen NASA as a multi-mission agency with significant activities in science, aeronautics, and human spaceflight and exploration and technology development. Another key concern is the level of funding that's authorized. The proposed bill would slash NASA's budget by almost $1 billion relative to both the President's proposal for fiscal year 14 and the pre-sequester funding approved by Congress in fiscal year 12. And it would maintain that cut over each of the years of the majority's authorization bill. The severe cuts to NASA's top line are manifested throughout the draft bill. For example, Earth science would be cut by almost $650 million relative to the fiscal year 2014 request, meaning the Earth science account is cut by 1/3. Cuts to Earth science would not only result in gaps in the data needed to understand changes in our Earth system, it would also impact on the data needed for water monitoring, forest and timber productivity forecasting, improving gas and electric utilities load forecasting, and assessing the impact of sea level rise in coastal communities. These uses and societal benefits are exactly what we hope for when we make federal investments in research and technology. To stop them would be irresponsible. And the bill appears to shift all space technology activities to support only exploration-related technology development. More importantly, the proposed reduction in funding for space technology will not keep NASA on a path aligned with 21st century innovation and job creation. Plans to pursue new technologies such as in-space propulsion and cryogenic fuel storage may suffer. The impact of making these reductions was not discussed in preceding hearings, as they should have been. Compounding these things, the bill establishes aggressive milestones and activities that run contrary to proposed downsized levels. Without any real regard for safety and schedule, these are exactly the pressures of the lessons that we learned from both Challenger and Columbia, and we can't afford to repeat those tragedies. We cannot expect NASA to develop a sustainable and inspiring space program under these circumstances. And Mr. Chairman, this subcommittee has historically done best for NASA when we move legislation in a bipartisan manner. At a minimum, now that the draft bill is open for discussion and before we begin considering a markup, we should first take the time to hold hearings with valued experts and stakeholders impacted by the bill's provisions, especially in areas such as earth science, space technology, and commercial crew safety. As we'll hear from one of the witnesses today, one way of counteracting the high cost of human exploration may be in the form of expanded international partnerships. This is an idea that needs to be considered, as the journey to Mars will be long, yet rewarding for the future of humankind. Thank you, and I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today.
Thank you, Ms. Edwards. If there are members who wish to submit additional opening statements, your statements will be added to the record at this point. Oh, I apologize, Ms. Johnson. Our ranking member is present. I now recognize the ranking member of the full committee for her remarks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and good morning. And I'd like to join you in welcoming our witnesses to this morning's hearing. You both have offered valuable counsel to our committee in the past, and I'm certain you will do that again today. As the chairman has indicated, we're here today to begin our review of the majority's discussion draft of the NASA Authorization Act of 2013. Those who know me know that I consider NASA to be a critical part of the nation's innovation infrastructure, a driver of technological and scientific progress, a positive symbol of the United States throughout the world, and most importantly, a source of inspiration for successive generations of our young people. I strongly believe that any NASA authorization bill that comes out of this committee should reflect these realities. Unfortunately, the draft bill that we are starting to examine today doesn't do that. It doesn't contain funding commensurate with the task NASA has been asked to undertake. In fact, it gives NASA additional unfunded mandates while maintaining deep sequestration cuts over the life of the bill. It contains policy direction that I fear will do long-term damage to the agency. And I regret to say that if enacted, it would not help NASA meet the challenges facing the agency. In short, it is a missed opportunity to position NASA for excellence. And it's a bill that, if enacted, would lead to the erosion of the capabilities that have made NASA such a positive force for progress. Why do I say that? Well, I've already mentioned the deep and sustained cuts this bill makes to NASA's overall budget at a time when we should be investing more in NASA, not putting it on a path to mediocrity. It also cuts NASA's earth science budget by 1/3, which I find very baffling. Certainly, the committee has held no hearings on NASA's earth science program in this Congress nor the 112th Congress. So it's hard to see any justification for these cuts. It makes equally damaging cuts and changes to NASA's space technology program, again, without explanation. And despite, on the one hand, putting NASA's budget on a path of declining purchasing power for the foreseeable future, it, on the other hand, directs NASA to establish major new programs, not just goals, for sustained human presence on both the Moon and Mars. Moreover, in addition to imposing other unfunded and underfunded mandates on numerous NASA programs, it also sets an arbitrary deadline by which NASA will have had to carry out a successful commercial crew flight to the International Space Station, a deadline that I fear will lead to the kind of schedule pressure The Columbia Accident Investigation Board warned against a decade ago after the tragic loss of the Space Shuttle Columbia. Mr. Chairman, there are other areas of this draft legislation that I fundamentally disagree with, but I think you have a sense of my overall view. This is not a bill ready for markup. This is a flawed draft, starting from its funding assumptions, and I cannot support it in the present form. I also predict that if passed by the committee, this bill would be DOA in the Senate, DOA meaning dead on arrival. Rather than moving directly to an unproductive markup, I hope that the majority will take a step back. At a minimum, hold additional legislative hearings so we can hear from the affected parties what the impacts of the proposed cuts and changes to earth science, space, and technology will be. We also need to hear from the congressionally established Aerospace Safety Advisory Panel on its views of this legislation, because I know that no member of this committee will want to do anything that would jeopardize safety. In closing, NASA is an investment in our future. The women and men who work at NASA are some of our best and brightest. We owe it to them and to our children and grandchildren to take the time to produce a NASA Authorization Act worthy of this committee. I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. And again, the purpose of this committee is to hear our members' concerns, issues, and questions, and also have some debate on those issues. If there are any members who wish to submit additional opening statements, your statements will be added to the record at this point. At this time, I would like to introduce our panel of witnesses. Our first witness is Dr. Stephen Squires, the Goldwin Smith Professor of Astronomy at Cornell University and Chair of the NASA Advisory Council. Our second witness is Mr. Thomas Young, former Executive Vice President of Lockheed Martin Corporation. As our witnesses should know, spoken testimony is limited to 5 minutes each, after which members of the committee have 5 minutes each to ask questions. Your written testimony will be included in the record of the hearing. I now recognize our first witness, Dr. Squires, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear today. 3 themes run through my testimony. First, NASA needs a clear and compelling long-term goal. In my opinion, that goal should be to send human explorers to Mars. Second, NASA is being asked to do too much with too little. Unless program content can be matched to budget, the result will be wasted effort and delay. Third, our nation's civil space program will be best served by having high-level policy set by the administration and Congress and implementation details recommended by NASA engineers, scientists, and managers. I recently testified in a hearing before this committee entitled Next Steps in Human Exploration to Mars and Beyond. An underlying assumption of that hearing was that a crucial future goal for NASA should be to send human explorers to the surface of Mars. I argued then, and I reiterate now, that sending human explorers to Mars to learn whether or not life ever emerged there is a goal worthy of a great national space agency. It should be NASA's #1 long-range priority. To make progress towards the goal, the Draft Authorization Act wisely calls for NASA to develop a Mars human exploration roadmap. But then, with little technical justification, the draft legislation also dictates what some of the key elements of that roadmap should or should not be. Specifically, it directs NASA to establish a program to develop a sustained human presence on the moon and forbids NASA to fund the development of an asteroid retrieval mission. I believe that it would be unwise for Congress to either prescribe or proscribe any key milestones in NASA's Mars exploration roadmap at this time. Personally, I agree with the Draft Authorization Act's position on the asteroid retrieval mission, and I disagree with its position on a sustained lunar presence. But my personal views are not the point. In the 1960s, the government set the high-level goal of sending humans to the moon and then left it to the engineers and the scientists and managers of NASA to find the right program architecture to achieve this goal. I believe that a similar approach should be taken to achieving the goal of getting humans to Mars. I urge that milestones not be dictated, either by the administration or the Congress, without allowing NASA to develop a technically sound roadmap first. The objective of this roadmap should be to achieve the goal of human exploration of Mars as quickly and efficiently as possible. And then once a viable roadmap has been generated, the additional technologies, vehicles, and milestones that are needed to make it a reality will become clear. Moving on to space science, this program has been one of NASA's major success stories for many years. Priorities across the full sweep of space science have been recommended by the National Research Council's decadal surveys. I'm pleased that the Draft Authorization Act places particular emphasis on assuring that NASA's space science program follows decadal priorities. Unfortunately, tight budgets and mission cost overruns have put NASA's space science program under pressure. Recent administration budget requests have funded most space science disciplines adequately, but have included cuts to planetary exploration that were so deep as to appear punitive. The Draft Authorization Act, in contrast, restores funding for planetary exploration, but introduces alarmingly deep cuts to Earth science. I feel it's important that cuts be driven by science priorities as outlined in the decadal surveys, and that they be distributed sensibly across disciplines. So I urge this committee to strive for balance in the space science portfolio rather than singling out Earth science or any other discipline for disproportionate cuts. The Draft Authorization Act would reorganize the Space Technology Program by moving much of the responsibility for technology development to the Human Exploration and Operations Mission Directorate. Unfortunately, when budgets are tight, it's tempting for mission directorates to use technology funds to solve today's problems rather than enabling tomorrow's missions. So I favor a more distributed approach in which only technology funding for specific near and medium-term needs of a mission directorate resides within that directorate. I feel that longer-term and more broadly applicable exploration technology funding is better maintained in a separate technology organization, helping protect it from being used to solve immediate mission problems. Returning to my opening themes, I believe that the mismatch between the agency's aspirations and its budget is the most serious problem facing NASA. Unless a solution is found, some very hard choices may have to be made soon. Specifically, a choice is looming, I believe, regarding whether the focus of human spaceflight should be ISS utilization or moving beyond low Earth orbit. At projected budget levels, I fear that NASA will not be able to do both of these safely and well. Part of the solution may be international partnerships. If no major funding increase for NASA is forthcoming, then I believe that the agency should aggressively seek out international partners for human exploration beyond low Earth orbit. If capable partners who are willing to shoulder a substantial fraction of the cost of deep space exploration can be found, then it may be possible for NASA to maintain something like its current portfolio of activities. Otherwise, I fear that a painful reduction in program content may lie ahead. Despite the challenges that it faces, NASA is one of our nation's greatest assets and a source of pride for all Americans. An Authorization Act that enunciates a clear and compelling long-term goal for the agency, that matches program content to budget, and that lets NASA formulate the implementation details of national civil space policy will allow it to remain so. Again, thank you for the opportunity to appear today.
Thank you, Dr. Squires. I now recognize our next witness, Mr. Young.
Chairman Palazzo, Ms. Edwards, and committee members, I'm pleased to have the opportunity to present my views on the issues I believe to be important as you prepare the NASA Authorization Act of 2013. The United States Civil Space Program has been the source of enormous pride, prestige, knowledge, and awe-inspiring technology. This has been the product of the exceptional men and women in NASA, other government agencies, industry, and the scientific community working with highly competent leadership. This integrated effort is the foundation of the United States Civil Space Program. As we move forward, there are storm clouds over this great human endeavor that require attention. Nothing is more important than maintaining NASA as the premier civil space organization, including maintaining the special capabilities of other government agencies, industry, and the scientific community. This can only be achieved by having challenging, inspiring, and worthy things to do. Studies, technology pursuits, and overseeing others are important, but will not maintain the civil space program as world-class. We must endeavor to populate the Authorization Act with worthwhile opportunities that maintain these critical capabilities. To maximize the return from the investment in the civil space program requires that program content be in balance with the budget. This is a much discussed but seldom achieved goal. We continually operate with a budget that is inadequate to implement the established program. Our inability to delete worthy but lower priority endeavors results in this imbalance. Too much program for the available budget results in inefficiencies, excessive risk, and program cancellations. The result is that less is accomplished for more. Pay-as-you-go is a much-discussed concept that I believe has merit. Go-as-you-pay is a useful concept when deciding the point at which the budget will support starting a project. Go-as-you-pay is a most wasteful concept for the implementation of a project. The dominant strategic issue facing the civil space program today is human spaceflight. Today, there is a human spaceflight program, but no credible human space exploration strategy. There's much discussion about going to the moon, an asteroid, Phobos, Deimos, and Mars. However, there is no credible plan or budget. There are human exploration elements, such as SLS and Orion. The NASA budget contains about $8 billion for human spaceflight, not including infrastructure cost. This funds the International Space Station, SLS, Orion, some technology, commercial cargo, and commercial crew. If the budget remains approximately the same, my judgment is that there are two basic choices: a space station-focused human spaceflight program or an exploration-focused program. I do not believe the budget is adequate to accomplish both, and a choice needs to be made to have a credible path forward. I believe as a part of making this choice, an independent assessment of the value of the ISS return for the significant portion of the NASA budget that is dedicated to ISS is necessary. A senior review is a concept that is appropriate for conducting this assessment. If this human spaceflight strategy issue is not resolved, the graveyard of canceled, abandoned, and unachievable endeavors will continue to be populated. The responsibility for leading the resolution of the strategic issue should reside with NASA. Another strategic issue that's important resides in the science area of the NASA program. There are a small number of profound questions for which the United States is in a leadership position and is on the cusp of greatly increasing our knowledge. These include, are we alone? What is dark energy and dark matter? What is the future of our climate? Is the United States going to be a leader in these profound areas, or are we going to voluntarily move to the sidelines? Decadal surveys have identified the top priority programs in pursuing these special opportunities. Sample return from Mars, a wide field IR telescope, and missions identified in the Earth Science Decadal deserve priority consideration in the new Authorization Act. Technology is important seed corn for the civil space program. A debate in any organization involved in high technology pursuits is, should the technology be managed in a mission organization to maximize the relevance of the technology, or should the technology be managed in an independent organization to maximize the probability that the technology program will be implemented? The risk of the former is that the demands of implementing challenging projects will consume all the resources, thus sacrificing technology endeavors. The risk of the independent organization that the technology will be less relevant to NASA's missions and become an end in itself with scope beyond what is affordable. I believe the independent organization concept with a strong oversight process to assure maintaining relevance and responsibly containing scope of the endeavor is the best balance of merit and risk. The final topic I want to discuss in my prepared comments is leadership. I place my toe in these troubled waters with great reservation. However, I believe leadership of the civil space program is a topic that must be openly discussed. I strongly believe the leadership of the U.S. civil space program must be vested in NASA. This includes both formulation and implementation. Politics and ideology are a part of the fabric of our democracy. However, they should be relegated to lower-level issues in the civil space program. I recognize there are times when national issues are important factors, as was the case with Apollo. However, NASA has been and will be sensitive to such issues. NASA is about science, engineering, exploration, and discovery. NASA really is rocket science in its broadest definition. Leadership of the civil spacecraft program must have the capabilities and experience consistent with this demanding charter. Today, leadership of the civil space program is diffuse, and authorities invest in organizations, while important, that do not have the expertise to be in a controlling role. This is a prescription for mediocrity, whether it be an organization of great national importance, an industrial corporation, or a local community organization. I have great worry about what I believe to be a declining trajectory for NASA and the civil space program. I believe the most significant factor in this negative outlook is the adverse leadership concept I observe. As an example of what results from diffuse leadership with too much authority in the wrong places is the proposed asteroid retrieval mission. This is a mission that is not worthy of a world-class space program that is focused upon maximizing the return that can be realized from a constrained budget. NASA must be returned to the leadership role of the civil space program. If this occurs, many of the issues confronting the program will be very positively addressed. If not, the outlook is discouraging. The Authorization Act of 2013 will be important in achieving a positive trajectory correction for NASA and the civil space program. It is hard to overstate the need for a program that is focused upon the highest priority opportunities, a program that is consistent with available funding, and a program with leadership vested in NASA. Great nations do great things. The United States is a great nation, and I continue to believe the civil space program is a great thing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Young. I thank the witnesses for being available for questioning today. Reminding members that committee rules limit questioning to 5 minutes. The chair will at this point open the round of questions. The chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes. One of the first questions I asked Administrator Bolden at our NASA budget hearing earlier this spring was whether the President's budget request would cause a slip in the schedule for the Space Launch System. Administrator Bolden replied that it would not. After looking at the budget request, however, it became apparent that if this was indeed true, the funding levels were barely enough. That's why the discussion draft before us calls for an increase of $70 million above the administration's request. Mr. Young, what funding levels are necessary to maintain the current SLS schedule?
I really can't answer that question, but I do have some comments on the question. One of the things that's in the authorization bill, and I pointed out, is that go as you pay is a useful concept when you're deciding when to start a project. But when you're implementing a project, it's a very most wasteful concept. And I think if SLS falls into the mode of a go as you pay program, then it's going to be highly inefficiently implemented. And what really happens in a go as you pay concept when you're implementing a program is good people accomplish all the work in a given fiscal year that they can for the money that's available. What they can accomplish, they move to the right. And this accumulates into schedule delays. But it's even more significant that you don't accomplish the program in the most efficient manner, and you probably end up with a lot of programs doing one program for the price of two. So I applaud your focus on this issue of assuring that the SLS funding is appropriate to implement a program in the most efficient manner. I'm just not in a position to make a judgment exactly what those dollars are.
Dr. Squires, you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think the thing I would add to this, and I've mentioned to this committee in the past, is that the real issue to me is not when the first flight of SLS takes place. It's the flight rate thereafter. And if you look at the projected budget and what it implies in terms of the projected flight rate for SLS, you wind up with a flight rate that is almost an order of magnitude lower than what was done for, say, the Saturn V system back in the 60s and early 70s. We have no experience with a human-rated flight system that only flies every 2 or 3 or 4 years. And I believe that's cause for serious concern. It's not just simply a matter of maintaining program momentum. It's not even purely a matter of efficiency. It's also largely a matter of just keeping the flight team sharp and safe and mission ready. So I'm deeply concerned about the flight rate of that system.
Can NASA afford to develop the 130 metric ton variant right now, or will it have to focus on the 70-ton version? Does anybody want to? No comments on that one? We'll work that one out later. I was just something curious that keeps popping in my mind. All right. Now, this is something I think y'all can elaborate on. Now, the discussion draft includes a requirement that NASA builds a Mars human exploration roadmap. Are there any additional requirements for the roadmap that you think should be added? Dr. Squires, we'll start.
Actually, I think the roadmap requirements in the bill are over-constrained. What I mean by that, I think the idea of establishing a roadmap for human exploration of Mars is great. It's one of my favorite provisions in this bill. But I think it would be best to allow NASA to do that problem, to work out that roadmap in its technical details and find the best way to achieve that, and then come back with a set of recommendations of what the intermediate milestones should be. As written, the bill prescribes certain milestones. For example, a sustained presence on the surface of the moon, which is, as the ranking minority member of the full committee noted, is an unfunded mandate. It also says that we should not do certain things along the way. I think, and I agree with Tom on this, that allowing NASA to take the first steps towards establishing what the roadmap should be, using the technical expertise that resides within the agency, would be an appropriate way to go forward.
I too applaud the roadmap. I mean, I think we are badly in need of a human exploration strategy. I think that the concept of doing the roadmap, NASA leading it, is good. Giving NASA as much flexibility as can be and putting together is also good. You'll always have an opportunity to critique the products as they come out. The only thing I would add to what Steve has said is that it's also got to be a roadmap that gives appropriate recognition to budget and what is realistic and what is not realistic. And I don't mean to over-constrain it by that, because if I had the job, I would look at options and various levels to understand what we can do, at various levels. But a strategy without the resources to execute the strategy, or a roadmap without the resources to execute it, is simply a hope as opposed to something that's realistic. So we've got to put it in the context of what is realistic to be implemented. But personally, it is the objective. I was sitting thinking as Steve was doing his testimony, I don't know how long I've been associated with Mars, but I almost have 3 children, Carter, Blair, and Mars.
Thank you for your comments. I now recognize Ms. Edwards for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Dr. Squires and Mr. Young. It's always good to have you here, and I just really appreciate the value that you provide for the committee. As I read your testimony and listened to you today, what I heard is that I think we actually can agree on some of the broad concepts of the bill, including identifying a roadmap to Mars, as we've just discussed, maintaining a balanced and steady agenda for NASA's programs as a multi-mission agency, and taking a look at how we can assure the effectiveness of the agency's leadership in maintaining a long-term vision. But there are some aspects of the draft bill that I think are really problematic, and I wonder if you could discuss with some level of detail, and Dr. Squires, you did, but Mr. Young, I wonder if we could have a comment from you about this idea of a sustained presence on the moon and Mars, because there is where I do think that there is, some significant division in the details, and I wonder if you might comment as well about some of the things that we could ask for in a roadmap, and a timetable that would allow us as a committee to look at what NASA is doing and ask those questions in detail without prescribing the scientific detail for the agency.
The The comment I'd make on the moon question that you have is the following. I do not believe that landing on the moon or operations on the moon is a prerequisite to going to Mars. So if Mars, given Mars as the focus, then it's not necessary, and it's probably a significant resource consumer that will take away from the time and the effort to go to Mars. I also don't want to imply that the moon is a useless location. And so that's not, from my standpoint, it's not meant to be implied at all. I mean, I think there's enormous, research, understanding, and benefit that can be derived from a mission to the lunar surface. I just think that if our focus is on Mars, it's not a necessary prerequisite, and it's an enormous consumer of resources, including time, and it really takes away from the basic thrust of a Mars roadmap.
Dr. Squires?
Well, I certainly agree with Tom that the reason to go to the surface of the moon is not to help us get to Mars, it's to go to the moon. And with respect to what you could ask for in a roadmap, certainly asking what are the appropriate technologies is the right thing to do. Certainly asking what vehicles, what specific pieces of hardware are appropriate to get the job done. And then I think there are a range of different milestones that could be looked at. Clearly, lunar orbit is a sensible first milestone. Whether there's a rock there that's been directed from an asteroid that's been brought in or not, it's the right place to go. The other milestones you could look at include the lunar surface. They include a near-Earth object of significant size. They include the moons of Mars, Phobos and Deimos. They include operations in Mars orbit, which is clearly going to be necessary. So I think you could lay out the range of possible milestones and ask the agency, okay, with these possibilities, what are the right ones that will get us most efficiently to the long-term goal? And then, what are the specific technologies? What are the specific pieces of hardware that are necessary? And one other thing that I would add is that I think it would be valuable to ask the agency and to more broadly ask the question, once we've identified the vehicles, once we've identified the technologies, are there ones in there that could be sensibly provided by an international partner to help spread the costs?
Thank you very much, because I think that would help us actually develop an authorization that would be useful to the agency without us as lawmakers, without the requisite experience pointing out the details of what it is that the agency should do. So I appreciate that. I want to ask you very quickly, both of you, the draft bill proposes to make drastic cuts in NASA's Earth Science program at a time when natural disasters here at home in the U.S. and abroad are wreaking havoc on individuals, businesses, municipalities, the entire economic system. And so I wonder if you could share with me what you think the proposed cuts in the legislation mean to our ability to understand, predict, monitor, and respond to natural disasters and to climate change.
I'm deeply concerned about the magnitude of the proposed cuts to Earth science, just as I was deeply concerned about the magnitude of the proposed cuts to planetary science in the administration budget. There needs to be a balance found. There needs to be a compromise found in which the cuts, if they have to be directed to space science, are spread more sensibly across the different disciplines. With respect to Earth science, the National Research Council's decadal survey for Earth science has very nicely spelled out a sequence of missions, a series of activities that could be conducted by NASA studying the Earth from space. And those have broad benefits, both in the specific areas that benefit humans that you outlined, but also just across the broad sweep of understanding the Earth as a complex system. The climate system, the geology of the Earth, the oceans, the sea ice, all of those are interconnected in a very complex way. And these missions are necessary to understand that system. And there are unexpected discoveries awaiting. There are unexpected consequences of flying these missions. And so I think...
I appreciate that. I think I'm actually out of time.
Okay.
So we'll let somebody else continue. And
I could go on that one for a long time.
I know that you could. I apologize. I'm going to slip out for a bit, but I'll be back.
and we could listen for a long time. I would like to say this bill does not require NASA to establish a moon base or lunar outpost. In fact, the 2005 and 2008 NASA Reauthorization Acts required NASA to establish a sustained human presence on the moon and authorized NASA to establish a lunar base. This bill authorized NASA to continue those pursuits already in existing law and to plan for eventual missions to Mars. So if there was any confusion, I want to clear that up. I now recognize Mr. Brooks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. By way of background, I represent Alabama's 5th Congressional District, the home of the Marshall Space Flight Center, and quite frankly, the birthplace of America's human space flight program. The Marshall Space Flight community plays a pivotal role in the development of America's space launch system, the next generation rocket system that empowers America to return to exceptionalism in space and stop the current, rather humiliating situation wherein America is reduced to having our astronauts thumb rides with the Russians. The people in my district who either have a keen interest in SLS or who are responsible for building the next generation SLS rocket system have had scant time to review the draft NASA Authorization Act of 2013. The early response, however, to these reviews have been, to put it mildly, most disconcerting. So disconcerting, in fact, that unless I receive differing expertise that satisfies me that our words in support of human spaceflight match our actions and deeds, I will have no choice but to vote against and otherwise oppose this Authorization Act. In that vein, I seek today's witnesses' expertise and insight in hopes that it will help satisfy these concerns. Page 5 of the draft discussion bill states, quote, $1.454 billion shall be for the Space Launch System. Have either of you had communications with any private sector contractor who is responsible for building the next generation SLS rocket to determine whether they can meet their 2017 launch deadline if they are authorized only $1.4 billion in FY 2014? And if so, who have you spoken with? What have they said? Mr. Young, have you?
I have not.
Dr. Squires, have you?
No, I have not.
In that vein, let me share with you some of the concerns that I've had shared with me from folks in my district. The first one is a gentleman I'm sure that you're very familiar with. I have a letter from former NASA Administrator Mike Griffin dated today, June 19th, 2013 at 6:11 a.m. He's doing this while he's at the Paris Air Show in Europe. Dr. Griffin states in part, and I quote, I wish to express my concern over the proposal to authorize 2014 funding for the Space Launch System at a level of $1.45 billion. It is not adequate to develop the launch system that was approved by the Congress in the NASA Authorization Act of 2010. Development of the SLS that was mandated by the Congress requires a 2014 authorization and appropriation of $1.8 billion. I repeat that, $1.8 billion. Specific requirements which cannot be met at this level of $1.45 billion include: 1. Concurrent development of the upper stage required to meet the 130 metric ton floor for human exploration capability that was mandated by the 2010 Authorization Act. 2. Schedule protection for completion of core vehicle development by 2017, again a requirement of the 2010 Act. 3. Completion of the interim cryogenic propulsion stage by 2017, necessary to reach the initially planned SLS capability of 70 metric tons. 4. Continuation of advanced booster development. I also have a much more candid, and I've excised parts of it for family consumption, communication from a former well-respected NASA employee. This person states, I have reviewed the draft authorization bill. I really seized up over the amount for SLS. It is too low. I have been talking for months now with the principals on the program on just this point, and the money they need to have a healthy program is $1.8 billion to the project manager for the rocket, not money to JSC, Johnson Space Center for Orion, not money to Kennedy Space Center for ground facilities. These latter things are good to do, no question, but without the launch vehicle itself, they are irrelevant. As important as building the rocket is building the right rocket, the 130 metric ton version, not the half-capable 70 metric ton first step that Lori Garver and the Obamans want to settle for. That version is quintessential white elephant. It is twice as big as what you need to get to low orbit to service the International Space Station, and thus very inefficient for that application, and half what you need for human space exploration, and thus inefficient for that application as well. Mr. Chairman, I urge this subcommittee conduct as many hearings as are necessary to determine whether $1.4 billion is adequate to construct the Space Launch System rocket and restore America's exploration in space as scheduled, or is merely a painkiller given to a terminal patient to ease the cause of death. That having been said, with respect to these two communications, do you all have any reaction?
I do. Mike Griffin, that probably was, in his afternoon work, even though you had it at 6 a.m. Yeah, my comment is the following. We actually know how to estimate the cost of these programs. Not with great precision, but within the, the realm of what's necessary for budgeting. And so this is really an example of some of the things I was talking about and testified before previously. We have the ability, based on experience, to do a reasonably credible cost estimate for projects like SLS. We can do it in a statistical manner. And we know that for a standalone project, the most probable result is the 80-20 statistical number. A lot of history on that. I mean, I've looked at NRO data, I've looked at NASA data, Air Force data, as others have, and that is the point at which you determine the most probable cost of a program. The next most important item is that the 80-20 not just be a total, but it be 80-20 every year. Because if I put all of my reserve and contingency at the end of the program, I may feel good about the total, but I've done nothing, which is probably what these letters are implying. So my recommendation or comment to you would be, get a credible organization who knows how to do independent cost estimating, and get them to do an independent cost estimate for the SLS given the launch date that you want to specify, and they can assess the realism of that, and they do it at an 80-20 level, and then you can really assess where the budget is relative to the reality as to what the program would cost. But I want to emphasize, we know how to do this. This is something that we really have developed a real capability for in the recent times.
Thank you, Mr. Young. Dr. Squires, out of consideration for the other members that are here, I'd like to ask the members again to try to keep their questioning and comments to 5 minutes. I now recognize Mr. Kennedy for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you once again to our witnesses for testifying yet again before the committee. A couple of questions, and broaden the base a little bit here. But for both of you, just to start, you mentioned in the administration's, you each mentioned this administration's STEM education reorganization proposal as an issue moving forward. In my district back home in Massachusetts, we have a number of programs that have been highly successful in reaching students of all ages and getting them interested in STEM fields. I share some of your concerns about potentially reorganizing these programs and losing the expertise of issue area specialists. I've visited some vocational schools that have amazing partnerships with NASA and getting kids really excited about fields of engineering and exploration. And I think we can all agree that increasing the effectiveness and efficiency for federal STEM efforts is something worth pursuing. Do you have any recommendations or any suggestions on how NASA can improve its education and outreach priorities going forward?
I believe that the administration's proposed reorganization of STEM education in NASA is deeply misguided. NASA is a unique organization within the government. It flies missions into space, and the technical audacity of those missions and their capability to inspire are virtually unmatched in terms of what this government does and its ability to get young people turned on by science, by technology. And to take that responsibility, the responsibility for sharing that capability with the public away from NASA and give it to, I don't care, any organization that doesn't do spaceflight, I think is a bad idea. The thing that makes NASA's education outreach programs as effective as they are is that they are conducted by people who have not only a deep knowledge for what they're doing, but a passion for sharing it. And you listen to some of NASA's scientists and some of engineers talk with young people about how excited they are about what we get to do for a living. You know, this is compelling stuff. And to take that away from the agency and hand it off to an organization that has no experience flying stuff in space, I think is just a bad mistake.
Fair enough. Anything you want to add, sir? No. Great. Then moving on, I'd like to hear a little bit more about your thoughts on the space technology provisions of the bill. As I understand it, authorization levels included in the draft are obviously much lower, and the program would need to be adjusted to support exploration-related technology development by moving much of the funding to support the human exploration and the operations mission directorate. How do you think that this would impact the future development of space technology?
The thing I commented on is not so much the level of the program, because that's important, but you know, it's very difficult for someone in our position to have gone through all the activities. But having been involved both in NASA and in the private sector for a long time, both operational missions and technology, the thing that's always struck me is that there's a constant debate, and that is there's a motivation to try to align the technology with the management of the missions or the projects, because that really makes it most relevant. I mean, no question, they're the users. The problem is when the crunch comes, and it always comes, the resources that are there for the technology gets used to solve problems on the missions that you're trying to execute. And I don't offer that as being wrong. I mean, that's the priorities that people have to take. The other side of it is that you put technology in a technology organization. And there are some dangers there too, because then the technology kind of creeps away from being as relevant as you want it to be. It falls more in the paradigm of building the technology budget as opposed to the overall balance of the activities. And it can kind of become an end in itself, as I commented. So you've really got those two situations. There's not an optimum solution. Having watched it, lived it, seen the merits and the problems with it over time, I favor putting it in an independent organization. However, with a strong oversight capability.
Sir,
to assure relevance and to assure that it doesn't get out of control. The NRC of the academies is a great oversight kind of an organization.
I've got 3 seconds, but briefly, you both commented on the asteroid retrieval mission. I seem to sense some skepticism from both of you on that mission. If not in the, are there technological advances, are there gains that can be made if our overall goal, NASA's goal is getting to Mars, that benefit from the asteroid retrieval mission? And if you can answer it in less than 10 seconds.
I personally don't see a strong connection between the proposed asteroid retrieval mission and sending humans to Mars, but I believe NASA should at least be given the opportunity to try to make that case. I haven't heard it yet.
My belief is that any technology comes out of it, there are better ways to do it. And I'm a passionate, as you go forward with the Authorization Act, to utilize whatever resources are available on the highest priority endeavors. And my judgment is this is not a highest priority endeavor.
Thank you both, and thank you, Mr. Chair, for the flexibility.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. I now recognize Mr. Rohrbacher.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. We just heard from my colleague from Alabama that the SLS project needs to be funded, and Mr. Young, the people he was quoting are the people who know how to do these numbers. I mean, Mr. Griffith and the rest of them, they build the rockets down in his district, and they say for this project to be sustainable and to meet the deadlines that we're doing and not cost a lot more in the long run, as you pointed out, that we're going to need to spend $1.8 billion rather than what is being authorized, which is 1.4. Seems to me that that should be a warning sign for all of us that this project is going to cost a lot more money, and that money's got to come from somewhere. The tooth fairy isn't going to leave it under our pillow. And all of these talks, when we're talking about these other things that NASA does, like whether it's inspire young people or whatever it is that NASA wants to do, that's going to suffer, and it's going to go into this rocket, what the SLS Titanic, as I like to describe it, but this huge, massive rocket that our other witness, Mr. Young, has already stated that he studied, and it's only got 1 or 2 uses that we're going to have out of that rocket. Doesn't this mean that, frankly, I differ from my colleague from Alabama. I think all of this adds up to we are on the wrong course, and we should just get away, cancel this project. It is not sustainable and will drain money from every other thing that we want to do in space eventually. And the worst of all, it may end up being canceled, as you've pointed out so many times, Mr. Young. In the past, we've seen so many of these canceled after spending billions and billions of dollars right down the toilet. I'd like to ask Mr. Squires, you have stated, we all seem to assume that getting to Mars as soon as possible is got to be our ultimate goal. That just seems to me to everybody's accepting that. I don't accept that. There are a lot of other things we need to do in space before we need to get to Mars. But Mr. Squires, do you believe that this massive rocket project that you seem to be skeptical about as well, is that a prerequisite to going to Mars?
Certainly some kind of heavy lift capability is a prerequisite to get to Mars. Mars is far away. But SLS, you know, I said in my opening statements that I believe that the biggest challenge, the biggest problem facing the agency is that NASA is being asked to do too much with too little. And this mismatch between the amount of money that's necessary to do SLS right and the amount of money that's actually available is symptomatic of that. Both Tom and I in our opening remarks pointed out that we see some tough choices looming in the area of human spaceflight. We can afford to utilize the space station, which we've invested so much in, for as long as its operational lifetime. We can afford to develop SLS and to do it on a safe and reasonable schedule, but I don't see that we can do both. And so there may be some very tough challenges ahead for this agency and some tough choices to be made.
There are other alternatives that are out there, and we do have a proven rocket system right now. We have people who have done a good job at producing Deltas and Atlas rockets that are very effective and very safe. And perhaps those systems can be used, perhaps combined with a refueling system of some kind, rather than spending the tens of billions of dollars that we are going to spend to have this one launch system that seems to have one purpose. Let me just note this. It was noted earlier how important human spaceflight is. And I agree that it's important that we do that. But NASA isn't the only one in this ball game. There are 2 other programs that I know that are aimed at putting people into space. And it's not costing us the big bucks from NASA to keep people in space. I mean, we got Dennis Tito out there, and I happen to think that his project will inspire a lot of people. When we're talking about inspiring humankind, and especially young people, I think Dennis's concept of sending a man and a woman around Mars, that's going to capture everybody's imagination. Let's hope he's successful, however. And the other thing is SpaceX, of course, and others are putting money into developing systems much cheaper than what we're talking about here, putting people into space in term for a number of purposes. One, to go to the space station, so we won't have to hitch a ride with the Russians. So when we look at this budget, we're going to be looking at these budgets, Mr. Chairman, and you're going to be looking at this budget. I don't know how much longer I'm going to be around, but you're going to be around a long time, and you're going to remember when we started this program, and in the end, you're going to have to live through all of the cuts of everything else that we're going to have to cut to keep this giant rocket program going. There are other alternatives I think we should be looking at seriously. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Rohrbacher. I now recognize Ms. Wilson, or we'll go to Mr. Veazey.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. And I wanted to ask Dr. Squires and Mr. Young a specific question about the ISS program. I know there's been a lot commented on the intrinsic value and strength of the international partnership that the ISS program has engendered over the decades since the partnership was established. And what I wanted to know specifically from you is how important is it to build on the ISS partnership in future human exploration endeavors?
I think it's tremendously important. ISS is a technological marvel, but it is also a management marvel. To have had that many nations work together so effectively to build such a magnificent piece of hardware, it's unparalleled, I think, certainly in the history of space exploration. And the International Space Station truly is international to a deep, penetrating degree. The entire system is deeply international, and that's manifested in a whole bunch of different ways. I believe very strongly that in order for NASA to find a way to deal with the level of overcommitment that is expected of the agency, for NASA to be able to do the things out in deep space that we would like to see happen with anything like the kind of budgets that we're talking about here, there has to be a really substantial international component to that. And so I think building on the partnerships that have been really established so effectively in the management of the International Space Station, it's really been a triumph. And I think trying to take that capability and extend it beyond low Earth orbit is probably going to be absolutely necessary.
I really don't have anything to add. I think that's exactly right. I mean, from the international relationship aspect, hard to imagine anything more successful than the space station has been in that regard, and building on that in doing whatever the next major thing we encounter or we undertake, I think is extraordinarily important.
If I could just add one more thing to my remarks on that, and that is that if international partnerships are going to be a key element of our roadmap for exploration of deep space, it would make sense to involve our potential international partners in the development of that roadmap so that they have a sense of ownership of it.
What would be the impact of disrupting the partnership without a follow-on program?
It's a good question. It's kind of the nature of the business. I mean, that that to have continuity is certainly a virtue, but I would not make it a requirement. In other words, I think that we should collectively figure out the most important things to do, and then how's the most effective way to execute them, rather than say we have a workforce, we have an international partnership, and now we've got to kind of fill that international partnership. I don't know if that's very helpful, but that would be my general reaction.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance.
Thank you, Mr. Veazey. I now recognize Mr. Posey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank both the witnesses. And if I heard you correctly, both of you place a high priority on human space exploration as being the #1 thing that we should be doing. If we started today, how long do each of you estimate it would be before we could place a person on Mars?
With the current budget?
Yes. That's well, we can do it for starters. Yeah, give me a date with the current budget and a date with the Apollo era budget.
With the current budget, bear with me, I would probably say never.
Okay.
I agree.
If you said, if we made this a national imperative, you know, to go do it, it took Apollo about 8 years, if I recall correctly. I was around doing much of that activity, and I mean, it was truly a national endeavor. Mars is harder. There are a lot of significant issues to resolve before going to Mars, but I think if we had the same national commitment to it, what we're at 2013, I would say 2025 we could land on Mars, humans, and return them safely to Earth.
During Apollo, you were around and I was around, and that was done in 10 years. I'm told they could not repeat that performance today. Don't know whether it's true or not. And if you recall, that's when they carried around slide rules. The IBM mainframe was a quarter as big as this room and did about what you can get a little calculator to do for $5 at Walmart today. It's amazing. It seems like we have regressed somewhat in some of our abilities.
Can I comment on that? I mean, if I might,
Certainly.
I know I'm eating into your time. It really builds on some of what I think is important in this Authorization Act. I actually think we could repeat that if we managed the enterprise today the way we managed it then, and I knew the leaders who were doing that, and we invested the authority and responsibility in the people executing the program the way we did it then. So I'm not distressed so much that we don't have the raw material capability. I'm distressed that we have a management process, oversight process, et.cetera., that complicates the world.
Yeah, thank you. And we don't seem to have. I mean, we've seen polling, and I keep copies of it, from 76% of the people thought the shuttle was a good program to some people today, a more recent poll, they rate their dislike of space funding next only to welfare. And it's not a good position for us to be in. And I mean, it'd be great if we could have, what is it, the Rice University speech the president gave. Why go to the moon? If more of us could hear that kind of thing in this day and time and inspire a little bit more. The president projects that 2030 is a quarter of a century from now is when we could get to Mars. And the question is, do you think we could maintain the public's interest, if we even have it now, to take a generation to complete a mission? Do you think without shorter, more precise, more exciting stepping stones?
Steve, you want to?
Well, I think that a necessary part, probably not sufficient, but a necessary part of maintaining public interest is in fact a focus on Mars. When the Curiosity rover landed on Mars recently, thousands of people showed up in the middle of the night in Times Square to watch it on television. People are actually captivated by Mars exploration. So I believe the focus on Mars is necessary. I'm not sure that it's sufficient. And so, as you say, the timescales are substantial. And so I think having some compelling milestones along the way is an important part of a program as well. I believe, and Tom and I think are very much of like mind on this, that it should be first and foremost left to engineers and scientists and managers at NASA to come up with the technically appropriate set of milestones, the ones that get us to the goal safely and efficiently, and then to have those reviewed carefully, both by organizations like the National Academy, but also, of course, by the Congress and the administration to make sure that they make sense in terms of maintaining program momentum.
And I concur. You just... We say on the one hand we need to have priorities, and people say, well, you need to balance your spending. You need to balance your spending. And I'm just afraid we're going to end up making NASA a jack of all trades and a master of none. So, and you're shaking your head, Jess. You have the same fears. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to cheat if I might. I think the other aspect of the milestones is don't forget about the robotic program and the excitement that will go along with return a sample from Mars robotically, which I think is a necessary prerequisite for the human program. And the idea of having a rover going out and collecting that sample and storing it somewhere where a vehicle is going to come along a few years later and pick it up and return it. I think you can build a lot of excitement around it. And as long as I've cheated a little bit, you'll remember Aaron Cohen. And Aaron told me one time, who was sniffing the Apollo program, when we were talking about the Constellation program, he said, we're about to find how hard it really was to go to the moon.
Amen. Thank you, gentlemen. Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Posey. I now recognize Ms. Bonamici.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you both for being here today and bringing your expertise. I just want to start by following up on Mr. Kennedy's remarks about the importance of STEM education. I just came from the Education Committee where we're marking up a bill and a lot of discussion about STEM education, and I just share the concern of making sure that we are engaging the next generation. I do want to note that NASA recently selected its trainees to become astronauts, and half of them were women. I think that's the first time that that's happened. We want to make sure that we have the next generation of astronauts and scientists and people who are interested in these fields. So I'm very concerned about whether we're going to be, through restructuring, affecting those existing partnerships between NASA and other education groups and entities. So I want to share that concern, and I know you've commented on it. I also want to bring up another thing. You know, many of us on the committee do not have NASA facilities in our districts. We might have involvement with programs like human spaceflight and missions to Mars just through subcontractors or others in the supply chain. But NASA has historically been a multi-mission agency with a balanced portfolio in human exploration, human spaceflight, science and aeronautics. And I know we're having conversations about whether those priorities should change. But because of that multi-mission history, I often discuss the importance of NASA's other missions, including the Earth Science mission. And I know Representative Edwards brought this up, but I'm the ranking member on the Environment Subcommittee. I know the chairman was here. And the Environment Subcommittee has jurisdiction over NASA Earth Science programs. So cuts to those programs cause me some serious concern. There's some significant national activities such as weather monitoring. Oregon State University, for example, receives funding through this program, and the work that they do helps in that area. And according to the National Academies, NASA's Aging Earth Observation System threatens a disruption in information that can help detect long-term climate trends that contribute to severe weather patterns. That affects not only space exploration, but a lot of other issues as well. So can you discuss the Authorizations Act's reduction in funding for the Earth Science programs, for NASA's Earth Science programs? What impact might that have on long-term weather and climate forecasting, both within NASA and other agencies, and how important is that work to space exploration?
Well, as I remarked in my opening comments, I view with considerable concern the deep cuts to Earth science that are contained in the proposed Authorization Act. It's clear that the administration and the Congress have, at least as Congress's views are expressed in this draft act, very different views of how to allocate money within the space science enterprise at NASA. And on the administration side, I've seen what I view to be alarmingly deep cuts in planetary exploration, which has been, I think, one of NASA's real shining successes in recent years. In this bill, the pendulum swings too far in the other direction, in my view, and has alarmingly deep cuts to Earth science. If we're going to see a NASA budget, if we're going to see an authorization level that's consistent with sequestration sorts of budgets, clearly some tough choices have to be made. But rather than singling out any one scientific discipline for disproportionate cuts, which is what I'm seeing on both sides right now, having those cuts sort of sensibly distributed across the space science enterprise, I think makes more sense. It's going to call on committees like this to come up with some compromises, and I urge you to try to do that. To get specifically to your question, if you look at the suite of missions that were recommended by the Earth Sciences Decadal Survey from the National Academies, they would focus on understanding the Earth as a system, not just focusing on trying to forecast tomorrow's weather, but trying to really understand the Earth's climate system, the Earth's geosciences, to really try to develop a systems approach to understanding the Earth. And that is inevitably going to pay off in providing decision makers who are wrestling with things like climate change with the kinds of information that are going to be necessary to make smart decisions.
Mr. Young, you're nodding your head. You agree. Thank you very much. I see my time has expired. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Bonamici. Now recognize Mr. Stockman.
I have a quick statement to make about I'm feeling as NASA's more symbolism over substance, and we've gotten away from, as you talked about in the 60s, where we actually did things. I think the reason the popularity has dropped is because a lot of people have no idea really what we're doing now. And it's kind of muddled, and we keep going off in these different directions. And I was wondering, what was the ratio of bureaucrats to engineers in the 60s versus now?
I obviously don't.
I'm going to do Jay Leno, I guess.
Yeah, I don't have that number. It's a great question. I will tell you, maybe a little bit relevant to that, because I grew up in NASA, and even up through some, modestly senior positions on Viking program, or landed a couple spacecraft on Mars, and being director of Goddard. And I finished that. I went off to my next life in the like 82, 83. The amount of time that I spent doing other than what I would call important NASA science, engineering, discovery, research would have been single digit. I mean, it was just not a factor. Now, don't get me wrong. I mean, OMB existed. Other organizations existed, but my time and my dedication was 95+% on doing science, engineering, research, discovery, whatever you want to call it. So I personally think that's a significant difference to what I observe today, and a source of enormous worry.
Well, I don't have anything like Tom's depth of experience, but in the 30 or so years that I've been in this business, I cannot recall a time when I have seen organizations like OMB exercising the level of oversight of minute details of NASA's program. I haven't seen that to this extent in the years that I've been in this business. And I think one of the things that characterized the early days that we're talking about here, the 60s, was that we had government organizations like OMB and like the Congress providing high-level priorities for the organization, and then allowing people like Tom, when he worked for NASA, to figure out how to actually implement those policies and carry them out in detail. And there's a level of oversight, give and take, back and forth, that goes with that. But I think that the level of detailed oversight that I'm seeing at the agency these days is certainly unprecedented in my experience, and I think in some respects, and Tom touched on this in his opening statements, has been detrimental to the agency doing its job as effectively as possible.
I think it's kind of ironic hearing a government agency complain about government. I kind of like that idea. I'm just amazed. I'm a little bit familiar with that, and I'm amazed at the side roads we take. And I think it adds 50% or more in the cost of a program, or more. I mean, it's bizarre, some of the things that NASA's requested to do, and the employees are requested to do, the diversion of time. It's just amazing to me that we don't have the ability to trim that back. But if we could do it all across government, I think we'd be much more efficient.
Yeah, I think you're right. Again, you're talking about going back. The first large space project I worked on was Lunar Orbiter, a robot which was fundamentally aimed towards picking landing sites for Apollo and Surveyor. We signed the contract for it, and 27 months after that, we were in orbit about the moon. And people were a little upset because it was supposed to have been 24 months.
Well, and the last thing I got is a more parochial question. They're moving the ArcJet facility. I wonder how that's going to impact future development or authority of other projects. Are you not familiar with it? Then I'll submit the question. You can research it. But I'm extremely frustrated seeing firsthand the amount of tangential and what I call non-productive compliance. It's over the top at NASA, and I just wish that somehow we could reduce that. Thank you. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Stockman. You know, there's been a lot of talk about priorities and missions without the proper funding. And I would just like to, I think this garners consideration that as mandatory spending continues to erode important discretionary investments like NASA, we are forced to make very difficult decisions. This is unfortunately the reality we must face until the federal government can get its finances in order. That is why this discussion draft complies with current law, the Budget Control Act, which passed the Senate, the House, and was signed by the President. And I do hope that we can get mandatory spending under control soon so that we can continue funding essential and discretionary programs like NASA, like national defense, like Homeland Security, without having these debates over making sure that we fund our priorities appropriately. So I want to thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the committee may have additional questions for you, and we will ask you to respond to those in writing. The record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional comments and written questions from members. The witnesses are excused, and this hearing is adjourned.